Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming on this wonderful day outside. Thank you for moving and coming to see Mr. Dwoskin. So I have a few announcements. Tomorrow we have You've Gotta Read This, where four librarians will be talking about their fall selections of books. It would be here in the auditorium, or if you want, you can stay at home and watch it comfortably on your sofa while a soap opera is playing in the background. Um, then on Friday, we have F1, the movie playing with the handsome Brad Pitt. And then we also have a concert. It's more like a children's concert, but I'm letting you guys know so if you're planning to come, you could come with your grandchildren. It's $5 per seat. It's with Grammy award-winning Jennifer Gasoy, and it'll be a holiday concert. So we hope to see you there. The tickets are on sale at the main desk, and they're $5 per seat. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Also, after them for the $5 a seat, the Rolling Stones are going to come live here also. So make sure you get your tickets for $5 fast. Uh, well, thank you so much for coming and sort of a normal winter day, but not a late fall day. Remember that. Okay, shh. Get yourself settled. You know what? I think it's gonna just. Remember, first day of winter, December 20th. So we're still more than a month away, and we've got this real midwinter type weather, which is really unusual for us, the way things have been going, but that's the way it is. I'd like to also recall or remind people today is November the 11th, which is Remembrance Day. And the people, as time passes, of course, Remembrance Day was declared for the First World War, when the First World War ended on November 11th, 1918. And of course, we're now 107 years later, so there aren't anybody left from that war. And even the Second World War, which ended in 1945, which is 80 years ago. So people who have any kind of memories of it would have to be around 90 years old. So time does march on, but it is a holiday that's celebrated in North America and also in Europe. So it's really kind of a holiday for the allies who were once allies who fought in both wars. And Canada made a tremendous contribution, especially to the First World War. And if you want to point your finger, this might sound a little bit odd, but if you want to point your finger at where the decline of English Montreal began, it really began with the First World War, because the number of English-speaking Montrealers who lost their lives in that war was enormous compared to the total population and compared to the population in Quebec as a whole. So there was really a huge number of English-speaking Montrealers who were killed in that war. I believe it might have been in Eaton's or in the Bay that they had a whole list of the names, and it just went on. You see these panels over here. It was like filled up panels, but 7, 8, 9, 10 panels like this long of just small little names that were written down there. So it certainly did leave a hole in the community. And when you have a population that's not huge to start with, when you have the generation that is the creative, the procreative generation, it really did kind of put a blow to the English-speaking community of Montreal. So leaving that aside, let's talk about what's going on this week. And I wanted to ask your opinion on something, the event of the day of yesterday, which was the decision of the Democrats to vote somewhat with the Republicans to end the government shutdown. And the question is the follows. The question is, do you think from the Democratic point of view, do you think this was a good idea? That's the question. And the people, there were 10 Democrats who voted with the government to open the government, or 8, we'll say 8, we'll call it 8 plus 1 plus 2. Yeah, 1 was independent. So, look, it's the question is still a substantial number, but not certainly not close to the majority, because there's 47 sort of Democrats and independents. Bernie Sanders is an independent and Senator King is an independent, but 4 out of 47, 8 of them or 9 of them, I can't remember, 8 or 9 or 10, they voted to open up the government. And I saw an interview last night with the Senator Kane from Virginia, who was one of them, and he explained his reasons. The question is, do you think this was a good idea or not? Now, I just would like to hear what your opinions are. You think it was a good idea? So what the people who right. The Senator McCain, Senator Kane, not McCain, Senator Kane, very eloquent senator from Virginia. He gave his reasons. He said, look, basically America has suffered enough, and we don't want to play political games and make the America suffer even more. So the suffering came in 3 main ways. The first, most obvious way is the aircraft chaos that occurs and is still going on this week, with thousands of flights canceled and delayed because of the shortage of air traffic controllers, who are part of the Federal Civil Service and who haven't been paid for over a month, and who are calling in sick, and they're not replaceable. So because they're not replaceable, the number of aircraft have to be reduced in the sky, leading to all kinds of chaos on the ground. And working up to American Thanksgiving weekend, which is the biggest weekend of travel in all of the US. So to get the Federal Civil Service going back again was one reason. The second reason, was that the benefits paid to the poorest people in the United States, we call this Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. That program gives money to 40 million of the poorest Americans. And these 40 million people are the bottom of America. It's still close to 15% of the whole population survived on these benefits, none of which are really high. So you're not talking about somebody getting $5,000 a month. You're talking about somebody getting $200, $300, $400 a month for, say, a mother with her 2 kids, a single mother with 2 kids. And that $200, $300, $400 a month makes the difference between being able to pay the rent, pay the light bill, pay for transportation, and pay for food. And, without that, people were just not making it. So, people were going to food banks, people were not eating. It was really a tragedy, but a silent tragedy, we'll call it. So that was the second reason for opening up the government. And then the third reason was that there were 2 million people, federal civil servants, who weren't getting paid. Not just people in the air traffic control business, but all of the federal civil servants were laid off. People working in everything that the federal civil service does. And these people were also suffering economically, plus things that they were doing were not getting done. So for example, just to give a few examples, the in the economics department, the calculation of the economic growth or shrinkage of the US, the determination of the amount of unemployed people, the determination of the spending of the US government compared to how much money was coming in. None of these figures were being produced for a whole month, and obviously these are crucial figures for economists and the Bank of the Federal Reserve and investors and the whole world to say, well, what do we do with America? Do we keep on buying, or is it time to sell? Is it time to stimulate the economy? Is it time to repress the economy? Without knowing what's going on out there, you can't make an informed decision. And the last thing was that the thing the Democrats wanted, which was to restore the federal government payment to the Affordable Care Act, in other words, people getting supplemental help for their health insurance, that was canceled on the day that the government went on strike. And the condition that the Democrats made was these have to be put back in order for the Democrats to vote to open the government. So the cancellation of this money comes basically at the end of the year. So hasn't been renewed for 2026. Because it hasn't been renewed, people were getting notices in the mail that their health insurance premiums were going up by anywhere from the smallest amount was about $66 to $100 a month. The biggest amount was $2,000 a month. So if you were, for example, making $65,000 and over, and you were over 65 years old, your healthcare premiums would be going up by $2,000 a month. Obviously, the average, even $65,000 is not a king's ransom in today's economy. And to get a notice saying that it's going to go up by $2,000 a month, multiply. So what they were paying before would be somewhere around $500 or $600 a month. Okay, so now make it $2,500 a month. 2,500 times 12 is something like 30,000. And somebody is making before taxes 65,000, that doesn't leave any money for anything else. So the Republicans just said, we are absolutely not going to do anything about this. You can keep the government closed for 5 years, we don't care. Given the givens, then, that's why the senators said, look, America has suffered enough, especially those people, the poorest 15% of the people, and all the air travelers, which is everybody in this season. They said, look, the message is given. It's the Republicans' fault that all this happened, and we have to draw the line somewhere and say we have mercy on the American people, so we're going to reopen the government. So that was their thinking. The thinking of the opposition, most of the Democrats said, look, our conditions were that they have to restore the healthcare funding, and they didn't. So why should we cave in? It's their fault that they didn't do it. Why should we sort of give them a victory without getting what we wanted in return? That's the opposite argument. Now, the Republicans' argument can say as follows. By and large, we said that we are not going to restore the healthcare funding. And the Democrats said, well, unless you restore it, we're going to shut the government down. We didn't restore it. The people suffered for 2 months of a government shutdown. And now we're coming back to the same thing that we were at on day one. So all of this whole thing was for nothing that the Democrats put the people through. You see, so that's the argument there. It's kind of the same argument that could have been made with Israel and the hostages, which is the ceasefire agreement and return of the hostages. That deal was put forth a year ago. And, the government of Israel just agreed to it now, that they could have had the same deal a year ago instead of putting everybody through all the same suffering that happened in the whole last year. So those are the political arguments on both sides. And it remains to be seen how this whole thing will be perceived by most of the American people. My feeling is, I actually think that it was a good thing that they reopened the government. And I think it's that the message that the suffering caused was not caused by the Democrats, but was caused by the Republicans. I think that message is believed by somewhere around 60% of the American people, because the Republicans are the ones in control of the government. So everything that happens in the government is their fault or their responsibility or their credit, depending on what the thing is. So therefore, I think that in a certain sense, it was a mature decision to reopen the government by the Democrats. I think their message was received. Not only that, but the issue of the Affordable Care Act, the money, the insurance money is still out there. People starting November the 1st started to get notices in the mail saying you are a recipient of government-supported health care. Your premiums are now going to be so much and so much. So that issue is still out there. Now, if the Republicans don't do anything about it, the people will have to pay all that money. So it's not as if the Democrats could say, well, we're not scoring any political points, because they are scoring political points, because the issue of healthcare has still not been dealt with. But at the same time, they are, they're willing to help those people on the poorest of the poor Americans who at least get their supplemental nutrition back. Now, who are these people? Most of them live in Republican voting states. Why is that? Because the Republican voting states are poorer than the Democratic voting states. So therefore, the people who need it the most are people who voted for the Republicans, but people who might say, well, listen, they didn't care anything about us. They shut the government down. And, maybe our votes were wrong. There's a very small changeover of people who change parties from one to another. Surprisingly small, by the way. The elections in New Jersey and Virginia showed somewhere only around 7 or 8% of people who voted people who voted Republican changed over to vote for Democrats. That's all, just about 7 or 8%. But 7, 8, or 8% has to be doubled, because you're taking away one vote from one party and adding it to another party. See? So it's a much better gain than having people who didn't vote show up to vote. Then you're gaining one vote. If you could change people's minds from one party to the next, you're getting actually 2 votes. So does anyone else think this was a bad idea for the Democrats to have folded? Yes, Myrna. You're talking about for the healthcare issue. Yeah. Well, yes, the funding. Some of the issues were that were agreed to were funded for a year, but the government funding as a whole was just funded until the end of January. But the funding for the supplemental nutrition assistance program, that was funded for a whole year. Well, first of all, all those pardons, yeah, you're right about all that. I mean, look, people who like him like all that. There's people who believe Trump and everything he says. So therefore, people who supported him were people who didn't deserve to be prosecuted by a political judiciary. And that's what Trump's message is, that nobody who was ever charged, anybody who I didn't like, anybody who I liked who was charged because I didn't like them, because I liked them, I should say. And therefore it's a judicial prosecution. Yeah, well, you know what? Whatever goes around comes around. Let's put it like that. If it would be very hypocritical, and I'm not saying people aren't hypocritical, they are, but just imagine if the next administration was Democratic and they did all exactly the same things as the Republicans are doing. What would the Republicans say about that? Um, uh, but you think that the government should have stayed shut until they agreed to supply the. Oh yeah, but this was not. Well, my guess, my thinking is that most Americans would say a pox on both your houses. Here you guys are fiddling around, playing political games. In the meantime, the planes aren't taking off and people have to go to food banks to get food. You're both responsible. I don't think that they would be so ready to point fingers at one group over another. I think that's why I think that the Democrats did the responsible thing. I saw that figure, but I did see that figure. What it means is that if people are not getting the health care that they need because they can't afford to go to a doctor, then they are going to die prematurely. The dying, everyone does that, but prematurely, that is the figure that I saw as well. Now, your point about the House saying we're not going to hold a vote, well, the fact is that this was done in the Senate. And if the Senate does hold a vote, and let's say they do hold a vote, and for issues of conscience or issues of changing their mind or issues of or political pressure from their constituents, that the Senate actually votes to restore the Obamacare, and then the House doesn't do it, well, then obviously there's political pressure and political blame to be put on a House that has to stand for re-election in a year's time. And you believe me, people who are sitting in the House don't want to lose their seats. It should be pointed out, and as I'm sure you know, that the 8 senators who did vote to open the government, none of them are up for election in a year's time. What that means is that they feel that maybe politically speaking, this isn't a good idea, but we have to do it because we feel it's the right thing to do. So none of them are, and the other thing interestingly to point out is the 3 out of the 8 are from New England and Maine and New Hampshire, and the people there don't have the same kind of bitter divisions that are present elsewhere in the U.S. That people who live in these places are used to having town meetings, town councils where everybody has their say. They're used to having political differences, but in the end compromising and everybody getting along. And that's a tradition of New England. So the 2 senators from New Hampshire, the 1 senator from Maine, were the 3 of them, the 8 who voted to open the government. So anyway, it's just all we could say is from our point of view It's a good thing we don't live in the States. And it's a good thing we don't have to go through this. And by the way, part of the reason of going through this is America has this weird situation where they have to set up a debt limit. The idea was to say, okay, we want to put a brake on spending on the American government. We don't want to give them a carte blanche and let them spend whatever they want. So what we have to do is we set a limit. Once the debt gets to a certain amount, there has to be a vote to allow the government to spend more than the debt. And since Bill Clinton, there hasn't been a president who's reduced the deficit. So every president, and Trump more than anybody, has overspent. So that means that there's this kind of crisis situation. Unless you vote to extend the debt ceiling, America's government has to stop working. Now, in other words, it's almost like a knife at your throat that happens every 2 years or 3 years or whenever this debt ceiling gets hit. This is the only country that does things that way. There isn't any other one that has done that. So in other words, sometimes you can have good intentions for good reasons, but the results of what you get are worse than if you didn't have them in the first place. And this is a good example of that. The travel chaos is not going to be solved in a day. This is going to continue maybe till the end of the month or longer, because it's not that quick that you could bring all these air traffic control people back. Remember also that Trump gave people the option of working until September on full pay and then quitting, but not working. They could leave and get paid till September, or they could work till September and then leave. So he gave an option of people who wanted to get out of the government to save money, that by this September they will have left. That means there's a lot fewer people working in the civil service than would have been the case had Elon Musk not gone through the whole civil service with a chainsaw. So people really, there really are a lot fewer workers in Washington now. And every time you lay people off like this, a lot of them just won't come back for whatever reason. For example, they might have found a better job somewhere else and they say, okay, I found a better job. I don't have to put up with this. Or they may say, you know what, now's a good time to retire. We're going to be off anyway. I'll take my retirement and that's it. And so you end up, it's hard when people leave their jobs, it's harder to get them to come back. And so that's why I'm saying that these pressure points, like the air traffic controllers, don't get solved right away. And anyway, that's just the story about that. Any comments, questions about this particular thing? Yeah, go ahead. Oh yeah, this went into my eyes. Yeah, sorry. You have to speak a bit louder. Yeah, there's the providers of the service and the receivers of the service are both hurt. Yeah. 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 Okay, let me just ask another question here. Let's come back to our local politics. One of our political parties just picked a new leader this week. Who was it? Which party and who was the leader? Quebec Solidaire is right. And who did they pick Saul Zanetti is who they picked. So the Quebec Solidaire political party, which kind of was created not that long ago to express a political viewpoint in Quebec that would be, we'll call it in quotation marks, progressive and sovereignist at the same time. So this option was one which the creators of the party felt was not being provided by the existing political structures. So you have a separatist party who is avowedly left-wing. And you might say to yourself, well, aren't the PQ separatist and left-wing? And the answer is not exactly. Not exactly. Not exactly. And the Quebec Solidaire, like many political parties, they started very slowly, but they did have a bit of success a couple of elections ago, two and three elections ago, where they elected somewhere close to 15 members of the assembly out of 120, which is not half bad. And they got somewhere around 15 to 20% of the vote, which is also not half bad. But their fortunes have been sinking of late. And what's so interesting about this party is that they are not nationalistic in the sense of saying that the French Quebecois are a nation and that they need to have their own independent country. Their emphasis is not on the Quebecois definition. They are more pro-immigrant. They are more anti-exclusivity than any of the other parties in the Quebec lineup. They are the ones who are strongly opposed to Bill 21, the bill that says that women have to wear hijabs. Women in hijabs are not allowed in the public service. They are strongly pro-immigrant. They are strongly pro allowing Quebec to receive more immigrants and immigrants from the third world. So they see themselves in that way. Now contrast that with the Parti Québécois, which says basically that immigrants who do come here have to sort of become a French Canadian within 3 days of their arriving. Otherwise, they don't count. The Parti Québécois is very strongly against the whole idea of a multicultural Quebec. They're strongly against the idea of allowing different groups to express themselves in different ways. They're strongly against the idea that a woman can wear a hijab and be a teacher in a school. So you can see the differences between these two parties, even though they both want to have Quebec as an independent country. The CAQ, the government in power now for 2 terms, and the government that will not be reelected for sure, they are sort of not quite as separatist as the PQ. They're not quite as anti-religious as the PQ, but close to it. So you could call the government in power the CAQ. I would call them PQ light. That's about where they are, PQ light. So there definitely is an expression of a different option given by this Quebec Solidaire party. Now, traditionally, when they started, they were a Montreal party. That's where their strength came from. We'll call them the plateau intellectuals of Quebec. And that is still where their strength is. But they managed in previous elections to elect people from outside of Montreal, from Quebec City, from Sherbrooke, I think they even had one from, trying to think now where they were from. I can't remember right now. Wait a minute. I'm not sure. In any case, the new leader, this Saul Zanetti, and by the way, they've always had this tradition of having a female leader and a male leader. So co-leaders, we'll call them, co-leaders. But Saul Zanetti is from Quebec City. He's born there, he lives there, he works there. So he's a Quebec City person. And all the other leaders of Quebec Solidaire, including the current female one, were always Montrealers. So it remains to be seen whether this will lead anywhere. They did horribly in the by-election that was just held. The last by-election in Quebec, they got 2% of the vote, which is nothing. And, you know, in any situation, if the PQ is looking like they're ahead in the polls, which they are, a strong Quebec Solidaire would take votes away from the PQ. So if this Quebec Solidaire just collapses, it's all the more reason to think that the PQ will win a stronger government than they might ordinarily do. Of course, the question becomes then, the Liberal Party of Quebec also picked a new leader recently, Mr. Rodriguez. And, what are his prospects? The Liberal Party was reduced in the last election to only Montreal and Pontiac, Western Quebec seats. They haven't been able to get any solidly Quebecois seat, in other words, where the people there living in that area are more than 80 or 90% of French Canadian. The Liberals didn't win any seats in those places. And obviously, if you have to be in power, that's where you have to be. So far, we haven't heard much from this new leader. And so far, the polling hasn't shown that this new leader has caught on with Quebecers. So that's the current update of the Quebec electoral scene. And, in politics, you just never know what could happen. But it looks as of now that the PQ will win an election, the next election around. They won the last two by-elections by convincing amounts. Terrebonne was one, and in Arthabaska was the other one. And ironically, since they are the ones who say that they want to have a referendum again, the amount of people supporting independence in Quebec is down in the 20%. So how is it possible for a party for whom, this is the most important thing, to win an election where most of the people in Quebec don't want a referendum and want to remain part of Canada? So this is the riddle of Quebec politics. There isn't an answer to it, but that's the riddle of it. Anybody have anything to offer on this subject? Anyway, just a thought. Now I had a few other things to talk about. Whoops, sorry, hold on. One of which is some interesting figures that I read about, and I had mentioned this before, but the issue, the combined issue of low birth rates and migration are tied together. And some new figures that I read came out this week, again talking about how few babies are being born and how few people are living together as a couple. So get this, for people aged 24, wait a minute, let me just be sure what I'm saying. Get the ages right, hold on. Where's my light here? People who are 25 to 34 years old in the US, if you are a male that age, more than half of you do not live with another person, meaning that they're not living with a partner, either a wife or a partner. So it means that men who are that age, the prime reproduction age, 25 to 34, more than half of men and 41% of women do not live with a partner. Think of how surprising that is compared to your day, compared to my day. I mean, if you were 24 years old to 35 years old when you people were growing up, when you people were young, because I'm putting you people and me in the same place, okay? So when we were young, how many people 34 years old were still not living with somebody or not married? It wasn't 50%, that's for sure. So when you look at the birth rates, meaning how many children do people have all over the Western world and all over the Asian world, it's under 2 children per woman of childbirth age. The lowest country in the world with the lowest birth rate is Korea. South Korea, they are now at 3/4 or less of a child per woman of childbearing age. 3.72 children per woman. You need 2.1 children per woman to have a stable population, because obviously there are some children who die before they reach the age of childbirth themselves. So that's why you have the 0.1 part. Now, that means that if this continues, population will start to go down, because obviously the more people are dying than are being born in so many different places. So that's the situation. Everywhere, including China, including Japan, including Taiwan, including Korea, even including India, where birth rates are really going down, and of course in Canada and the United States and every single European country, every single one, the birth rate is below 2 per person. I just saw this figure. In Bogota, Colombia, the capital of Colombia, 100% Catholic places. The birth rate is lower than in Tokyo, 0.91 to 0.99 of a child per woman, per childbearing woman. So this isn't something that's just happening in one place. It's something that's happening almost everywhere, with the big exception of Africa. Africa is the only place where there are more, I'm not saying the only country, because there's countries here and there in Asia, maybe Afghanistan or places like that, Iran, where there's more than 2 children per woman. But as a continent as a whole, Africa is the place. More than half of all children by 2050 of young children under 6 years old will be in Africa. Africa will have as many kids under 6 years old as the whole rest of the world. So it's quite significant to think about that. And then, once you know these facts, then you say to yourself, okay, so what does that matter? What does it mean? Well, it means if you have fewer people, starting with young children, it means schools will be empty. It means that young workers and people going to university will be fewer. It means that there will be more older people than younger people. The country with the oldest population is Japan. Japan has had now 20 years of population dropping. The population of Japan has been decreasing since they hit the peak of around 120 million. I think they're now just around 105 million. And it's predicted to go down to 50 million by 2050, 2060. So if your population goes down and you have lots of older people, obviously these older people getting pensions have to be paid by somebody. If those workers aren't working, who's going to pay them? You heard that Canada has just announced a change in the pension retirement system. Is no longer going to be, 65 will no longer be the compulsory retirement age for anybody. You can work as long as you want. You can delay your pension, as far as Canada is concerned, delay it forever, but you can delay it as long as you want, so that while you're working, you don't have to pay taxes on a pension and on your earnings. So if you want to keep working till 70, you don't have to start getting your pension till 70. So therefore, you won't have to pay taxes twice. You know what I mean? It's a good idea. But in France, where they tried to decrease the pension age, increase the pension age from 60 to 63, they've had 3 governments fall already over this whole issue. So they're super sensitive about that. So this falling population has all kinds of ramifications for housing, for schooling, for the economy as a whole. Okay. So the people who are, and I was reading about this in context of a kind of a natalism, white natalism people in the US who want white people to have more babies, a kind of a, nationalistic, fascistic kind of idea of let's make keep white mothers at home and having children so that we could replenish our population without getting immigrants coming in. They had a meeting about this, and that's where I received this information. Countries have tried to pay women to have babies. South Korea has decided to give women $20,000 US over 8 years to have a child. That's a pretty large number. In the US, they want to bring it from $2,000 to $5,000. In Hungary, 6% of the entire budget of Hungary goes to pay women to have children. So, with all this money going out the door, has this resulted in higher birth rates? No. Because, part of the slowdown in birth rates has to do with less teenage pregnancies than before. And less teenage pregnancies are coming because of education, because of birth control, because of the day after pill, because of people getting proper instruction on sex education and everything else. So that's one source of births that aren't there that used to be there. So if you can't pay people to have children, and women are being much more in control of their bodies than they used to be, so what's the answer? Immigration. Exactly right. Immigration is the answer. Where does the immigration come from? Where is it? Where is there a surplus of people, and where is a deficit of people? So the surplus of people is in Africa and the Middle East, and the deficit of people is everywhere else. So, the tendency, however, is in Europe, in America, in Canada, to slow down or stop immigration, especially from Africa and the Middle East. President Trump has announced that the amount of refugees the United States is taking a year has gone from 300,000 down to 10,000. And who are the 10,000 refugees he wants to take? White South Africans. That's it. As far as he's concerned, white South Africans are the only legitimate refugees in the whole world. So you could see that there is a conflict, there is a contradiction in this situation. Countries are afraid of losing population. They can't get more births from local people, and they don't want immigration from where the people want to immigrate from. So that's the dilemma. How is this going to be worked out? We have to see in the future. But the trend is, if you look at Europe, the political parties who are in power or going to be in power, in Great Britain, for example, the Reform Party, the super anti-immigrant party is leading in the polls. In France, the Ralliement National, super anti-Muslim, super anti-immigration, is leading in the polls. In Slovakia, in Czech, in Hungary, and Poland, these 4 countries have all elected leaders who don't want more immigration. There isn't any country, even Germany, where it was most open to immigration before. The Alternative for Germany party has come in 2nd place and might even win elections in some of the states in Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany. There isn't anyone. Italy, let's mention Italy, such an important country because immigrants arrive there. There's hardly any country in Europe that's welcoming to immigrants. Spain and Portugal, we'll call them medium. Greece, certainly not. So that's the dilemma. They're going to need people. These places, if you look within Europe, inside of Europe itself, inside Italy, inside Spain, inside Greece, the rural communities are shrinking. And once you shrink beyond a certain point, if you lose your last school, if you lose your last store, if you lose your last post office, if you lose your last restaurant, because there aren't enough people to support it, you've got nothing left. So there is a kind of it's like water going down a drain. The more it goes down, the faster it goes down at the bottom. So that's the crisis in these places. And it's a serious crisis. Young people go off to universities in cities and never come back because there's no future in the rural areas. The people who would love to be in the rural areas are the migrants. The migrants who've made it in Italy, some of them working in kind of rural villages. They're happy as can be because they're appreciated, because they're an extra body to send their kids to a school. They're an extra customer in the restaurant. They're an extra house to be filled up in a neighborhood of empty houses. So those people are really appreciated there. But as a whole, like I said, there is this crisis. Fortunately for us in Canada, we are the least affected by this crisis. Canada and Australia also. Because we still are accepting and we still understand that immigration is a good thing. But the percentages in Canada have changed a lot. The question has always been asked, is immigration good for the country? We used to have 70 or 80% saying yes. We're now down into between 40 and 50% saying yes. So even we've been touched by this sort of disease, we'll call it, of anti-immigration. For us in Canada, it isn't so much a cultural issue, but the idea of immigrants pushing up housing prices, pushing up rents. Because when they go to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal and there's a limited supply, then there's this issue of limiting immigrants for that reason. But we saw statistics were published saying that Montreal's population is going to fall in the next little while. I don't know if you saw those figures, but I saw some saying that our city is going to fall. The world population, let's just talk about the number of people in the whole world. The peak of the world population, according to the figures I'm looking at, is going to be around 2050. We'll have around 9.2 billion people in the world. And then after that, it's going to fall because of the reasons that I was talking about. Some people say that it will maximize itself at 9 billion. And even before 2050, maybe by 2040, the world's peak population will be hit and then will decrease after that. Now, like I say, on the whole, this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. People point to Japan and they say, look, the population has been shrinking in Japan for a long time, but the per capita income, the standard of living hasn't fallen because of that, because adaptations are made. Schools are turned into nursing homes. Schools are turned into old age homes. People who were teachers now work in old age homes looking after seniors. So it's a different kind of a teaching. So there is this adaptation. But, there was once this idea way back when a man called David Malthus, this British population expert, he in the 1700s said that if the world's population increases faster than the ability to provide food, there's only so much land in the whole world. There's only so much farmland. There's only so much food that could be produced. If people keep growing, there'll be a limit to how much food can be produced, and therefore people will start starving, and therefore the population will go down. He was wrong. He was completely wrong, because he didn't figure that science could tell people how to produce more food with the same land, more food with fewer workers. So we've been extremely efficient at food production. And even construction of building has become even also efficient. You can build apartment buildings of 50 stories. In David Malthus's time, there wasn't 50-story buildings. He figured that, if there's more people and you have to build more houses, there's less farmland, therefore less food. You get the idea. So we are, in our own lifetimes, living through this huge change that people did not foresee even 50 years ago. After the Second World War, there was a baby boom. People figured, okay, a baby boom can keep on booming. But the baby boom stopped. 1960, stopped on a dime. Birth control came in. Women could then regulate how many children they had. And so now, 60 years later, we're living with the results of that society change. And that's what we're confronting right now. Let me just see if there's something else. Let's see here. Yeah, so I was reading about, so why is it that all these people are single? Remember I said 50% of people are single? Why? Like, what's the reason for that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the advancement of women in society. In the olden days, a woman just was not, they could have had a job, but it wouldn't have been a job where they could support themselves and live a good lifestyle. Now, that's all changed. Women can support themselves and live a good lifestyle. The number of women graduates in medicine and law is greater than the number of male graduates in medicine and law. So a woman doesn't have to have a man to be married to support her. She could just live on her own. In Asia, there's been this, as you know, the sex preference for male boys. And when China had a one child policy, somehow or other, there were 15% more boys being born than girls. Obviously, there was a kind of an abortion taking place when the women found out that they had a girl, pregnant with a girl. So there's a surplus of males in China for sure. It's around 115 to 100. In India, it's a bit less, but around 106 to 100. So those places, there just aren't enough girls available. And because the girls have advanced in society, in those places even, they don't want to just get married. So there's a lot of poor, uneducated, rural men who will never get married in China because women don't want them. And because there's so few women around, they could have their pick. So that explains some of that. in our Western society. You know, people are on their screens all the time. They don't even have a chance to meet people because they're so busy on their screens and on Instagram that they don't actually go out to meet people. The political divide in the United States limits people how much. I mean, we just talked about how divided the US is. If you were a Democrat, a strong Democrat person, would you want to even date a Republican? It would be impossible. So therefore, there's fewer choices available for people to go out with, and therefore fewer marriages, and therefore fewer children. It all kind of one thing reinforces another in that way. Um, uh, um, uh, yeah, that's it. So that's about that. So I was reading, you might have seen this article. They were talking about, the article was how picky women are about dating. So some of them, they were saying, you know, when you look on Match, you know, these match up programs, like so many women say, I want a man who's over 6 feet. You know how many men are over 6 feet in the US? 15%. So if you're going to be that selective, you're not going to find the person that you want. And like I say, you know, if women are independent, which they are, many, they can afford to be as choosy as they want to be, because it's not an obligation to get married. And of course, because people who do get married later, the chances of having children or even a lot of children goes down. The meeting that I was reading about was this meeting of natalists who said, oh, you know, we want to have lots and lots of children because that's what we believe in God and this and all that kind of stuff. And there were like 7 men in this meeting for every woman, because you know. So it explains a little bit of this demographic situation of what's going on. And this roughly, not every country is the same, but in the Western world, it all follows that same trend. And so that explains, you know, why there are, you know, the number of children are so low. Yeah, just one other interesting fact. In 1800, wasn't that long ago, there were 1 billion people in the world. In 1800, the total world population was 1 billion. And today it's 8.5 billion. So think of it, from the beginning of the human race, we emerged somewhere around 1 million years ago of people being in the Homo sapiens like us. It took all that 1 million years to reach 1 billion people. And then it took 200 years to reach 8 billion people. So think of how quickly the world's population has jumped up. So therefore, if we're going to plateau and go down, it's not the end of the world, because we, you know, just not even 200 years ago, we had that few people in the world, just to give some perspective. Okay, so I'm going to stop now. Some quick questions or comments, and I'll see you all next week. And that will be my last class for the season. Yes, sir. It did. That is correct. So the plague, there was just not one plague, there was a series of plagues. The Black Plague in 1348 was the most serious plague. It did kill about 1/3 of the people. And what happened after that for the next 20 years, wages went up because of supply and demand. So that did happen. Um, some people would point to that sort of rebound as saying, well, this could have been the beginning of the end of the Dark Ages, because people, did have more money. So then they were able to do things they weren't able to do before. And that includes traveling, that includes learning, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, the one, but and that was mostly in Europe, but it did spread in the Middle East and to other places too. Now, COVID did take out a lot of people. COVID killed millions of people around the world. That plague, that was our equivalent of the Black Plague. I'm not sure of the total number of people that were killed, but in the U.S. it was over 1 million. No, you're right. You're right about that. We don't want another plague. The way things are going now is just fine. Anyone else? Yes, sir, over there. Yeah. Oh, about immigration. There's always this double reason for not wanting immigration. The strongest reason has to do with culture and religion. The second strongest has to do with economy, meaning if there's so many people coming in, they're going to lower wages and take away our jobs. But for sure, this idea, we don't want to change our culture. We don't want newcomers to come in and change our culture. That's the primary reason. But history shows us that after these waves of immigration come in, it just takes 2 or 3 generations, and these immigrants, whether they're Irish or Italians or Jewish or Greek or whatever, or Asians now, Indians from India, I mean, they become prime leaders in the economy and in politics and everything else. I mean, we had Kamala Harris run for president with an Indian and Black parentage. We have, the leaders of so many of the big industries today in the U.S. are all from Indian origin. So, that's the way it is. It's just people don't see perspective. They don't understand perspective. They think that whatever they see now is going to be the same always. They don't understand that immigrants who come, for the most part, want to become part of the majority eventually. There's always a few people who are bad apples, for sure. But in general, that's what immigration is. I mean, that's the nature of it. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week. Please come, and I'd like to say goodbye to everybody. Thanks.